This is Metro Week, our top story analyzing the city of Tucson's politics and economy ahead of the city election. A panel of longtime Tucsonans has experience in politics, journalism, and business. They evaluate the city's past and weigh in on how to shape Tucson's future.
Welcome to Metro Week. I'm Andrea Kelly. This week, a special episode devoted entirely to a discussion with people who are experts on Tucson. They are longtime Tucsonans we've asked to help analyze the city's past and its future. Joining me in the studio today are political science professor Tom Volgy, who's a former Tucson mayor. Joe Burchell spent decades covering the city of Tucson as a reporter for the Arizona Daily Star before he became editor of the paper's government coverage. And Daisy Jenkins is a former executive at Raytheon and Carondelet Health Network. She's now chairwoman of the United Way of Southern Arizona. First, thanks to each of you for coming in today.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like to start by having you assess what's your assessment of the city today? And we'll start with you, Mr. Volgy.
Well, the city's struggling. It's struggling with not having enough resources. It's struggling with economic development. It's struggling with infrastructure issues, struggling with education issues. Well, if you had me here 30 years ago, I would have said the same thing.
All right, and Ms. Jenkins.
Yeah, there's ditto to that. And I recently read a Brookings Institute report where Tucson was ranked number 5 of 11 poorest cities in the nation. And when 35% of our people have incomes less than $25,000 a year, that's disturbing. So while we've made some progress, there's a ways to go.
All right, and Mr. Burchell.
I think the city's at a crossroads right now. They spent the last decade living paycheck to paycheck. They've allowed their infrastructure to go downhill, but the economy's turning around. And it's now up to the supposed leaders of the city to either go the right direction or the wrong direction. We're going to see now whether Mayor Jonathan Rothschild can provide that leadership, or do we go deeper into the bucket?
Now, did the city make decisions decades ago that led to this point?
I wouldn't say decades ago, but over the past decade, they have thrived on making excuses for why it's somebody else's fault that nothing ever got done. But they're running out of excuses. They were afraid to raise taxes. They were afraid to cut services. They created budgets built on money that didn't exist over a 10-year period. So they dug a hole for themselves, but I wouldn't say decades ago, perhaps the last 12 years.
Mr. Volgy, you were on the city council in the 70s and 80s and mayor in the late 80s, early 90s. Would you say that it's been decades of decision making that got Tucson to this point?
Well, first, thanks, Joel, for not including me in that. I think we've had issues in the last 10 years, but we've also had huge structural problems that go way, way back. Part of it is what Daisy just suggested earlier. We have always been a poor community. We've always had huge inequality issues. We've always had an economy that did not struggle badly. And we've always had limited resources. We've also been stuck as a minority in a state that didn't like us very much. Politically, exactly. And as a result, we were always, in a sense, getting the shaft from Phoenix, from the state legislature. It's made life much, much more difficult. I would say, though, that at the same time, we've always needed to be far more creative than we have been. And we've had a sort of a power situation between the city and the county that's also made things difficult, issues complicated.
I definitely want to touch on that a little more later. Ms. Jenkins, do you agree that city council has kind of helped get us to this point?
They've certainly been a contributing factor.
And I should
not
clarify
solely,
that we mean many city councils.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean too.
Yeah.
Over the years, I believe that it's also related to the fact that the city has not leveraged the brain power and the innovation that's available. And so we've been fragmented. And as a result of that, we haven't been really able to coalesce and achieve the innovation that's necessary to move our city forward. It's a recurring problem.
Mr. Volgy, I want to talk a little bit about, we've talked kind of broadly, I want to narrow to some of the specific issues. And one of them is transportation funding, which we have struggled with in the city and the county and statewide for the last several years, but that's not always been the case. So what political decisions do you feel may have led to the struggle we have on that specific issue?
Strangely enough, I think it goes back to exactly what Daisy just said. There were decisions made in the 60s, way before our time, about what kind of transportation system we're going to have. And once those decisions were made, everything else became a constant struggle for a creative way of dealing with a problem that could not be addressed the way they could have been addressed in the 60s. So in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, there were proposals to deal dramatically differently with our transportation infrastructure. And it required a consent of the public to generate the resources to make it happen. And we ended up fighting. Mm-hmm. We ended up fighting because there was one side in the community that said, give us freeways or nothing else. And then there was another side of the community that said, you can't give us freeways. So there were these very dramatic options that were presented to the public, and we were ripped in half by the two sides, one trying to go backwards, the other one trying to go forward, and we never got it. We're sitting here very close to Speedway. We had a plan, for example, to bury Speedway between Campbell and Park and allowed the Speedway flow to be very, very different in the midst of a generator that brings in 45,000 people every day. It got beaten. And there are a whole series of other issues like that that never really got finalized. Or as somebody once said, Tucson had the best plans of any city in the country. It's just that they're still sitting on the shelf.
They have boxes and boxes full of plans.
Yep.
As a reporter and as an editor, how many of those elections did I cover?
Yep.
The grade separated interchange at Broadway and Alvernon, the freeway down the Rito River, the Grant and Campbell, the Speedway Tunnel, the first vision of the what became the RTA. Mm-hmm. It's over and over and over, never building any kind of a consensus to go any direction. And I think that's part of their problem now is they still, I believe, don't have a vision for what they want their transportation plan to be. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the problem is you have a start in this direction, and then we change people, and then they go this direction, and they end up going like short starts in too many different directions and never end up any place.
Ms. Jenkins, your experience in the private sector and now in the nonprofit sector as chairwoman of United Way, we've heard that over and over again in the last decade that the city has been hard to do business with, mm-hmm. hard for businesses to get started and going and our changes. Do you think, in your experience, that is an accurate representation of the outside role or the outside businesses looking in on the city as a government?
I think there was a time, and unfortunately it was far too long a period of time, where the city saw larger private sector employers as the enemy. And so the businesses saw themselves entrenched in bureaucracy that really slowed decision-making that could positively impact business growth. Current examples, a most recent example was the Raytheon expansion to have a buffer zone to avoid encroachment, residential encroachment. And that was something that was debated for far too long. And so what happened, Raytheon decides to build a missile facility in Huntsville, and then there's panic. Oh my God, our largest private industry employer is not happy. Well, read the tea leaves. That was the case anyway, and the city knew about that.
And it wasn't just tea leaves, there was outright conversation about it.
Numerous conversations. So it's those kinds of things then that gives the city a bad reputation. And you look at just most recently Grand Canyon University. And I think that was something that was an example of ward politics. So we have the situation, I think, since the recession of 2007, there's been some improvement in the city's outreach to the business community. But it has to go further than that. The mayor is certainly engaged with the chamber. He's been a strong advocate of preservation of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. So those are positive steps, but they don't go far enough yet.
Okay,
but they are positive steps.
In our conversation,
I would say they're positive steps, but what I've observed is they're mostly lip service steps. We talk a good game, but we don't have any money to put where our mouth is.
Well, I want to ask you all three a question about how much politics and party politics plays into what you've established here as kind of how the city got to where it is. How much of this is Republicans versus Democrats, platforms, party policies? Joe?
On that one, I don't think it is Democrat versus Republican philosophies. They're all in favor of good law enforcement, good economic development, whatever you say, they're all in favor of it. I'm going to pin it on two things. One is I believe we have gone too long without strong leadership of one kind or another. When Tom was on the city council, we had a Republican mayor and a Democratic council, but they still found a way to get done what needed to get done, and they found a direction they could move together. So I think it's a lack of leadership, lack of ability to bring people together more than Democrat versus Republican.
Yeah, I think it's also some issue with the city charter in regards to governance. The fact that our mayor has very limited powers, to me, that's an impediment to a lot of the decision making that should take place. I mean, the mayor isn't even his vote isn't even he doesn't even make up a quorum, and then you have a city manager with no authority. So I think those are things from a governance perspective that need to be rectified, so that those who are the key leaders in the community can lead without those peripheral impediments to decision making. And I think that's a problem in our community, and hopefully with the November elections we can correct some of that.
So the charter changes to give the mayor equal vote. That's on the ballot in November. So it would make everything up to 7 votes instead of 6 votes for most issues. Do you agree with what they've just said, Mr. Volgy?
Yeah, and I think incrementally that will make a difference. But I think the big issue is not going to be addressed by these charter changes. If you're going to have a key leader in the community who establishes the agenda and says, this is what we need to do in terms of economic development, this is what we need to do in terms of transportation, and you better empower that person with enough capability so he or she can lead. And we have this bizarre form of government. It's a medium strong mayor, council, city manager form of government. And giving the mayor an extra vote is going to be an incremental difference. But until we shift to the key person in the city gets directly elected by the public, we are not going to change this very much. There are very few cities in the country that have this form of government where the mayor has any authority. Chicago is one of them. And I would not want to follow the Chicago model in Tucson, because no matter what we all say, at least we are clean. We have a clean government system, not a corrupt one. Yeah. You can't buy this government. Some people say they don't want to buy it, but you can't buy this government. We need a strong mayor form of government. That will make a big difference. The other thing we need is leadership in terms of the metropolitan area. And as long as we have the city and the county, two separate entities struggling in two different ways, we are not going to have fundamental leadership change in this metropolitan area. We came within a half a vote of changing that once in the 1980s. And there was a unanimous vote on the part of the city council to disband the city and reintegrate it into a metro form of government. And it lost 2.5 to 2.5. at the County Board of Supervisors level. The world would have changed dramatically if that would have happened. And the leadership issues that Joe so well raises would have been dramatically different, cast in a dramatic different way. We would have had metropolitan planning, a single source where people could go to deal with some of the business issues in a very, very dynamic way. We missed that enormous opportunity. It's not too late for us, but it's getting a little bit later.
If we stay on this course, what is the future for the city?
Well, I think fundamentally, the single most important thing we have got to deal with is what Daisy suggested. You cannot have a world of enormous inequality and poverty in this community and still be able to address all the issues that we need to address. In addition to that, quality of life issues, educational issues, and so on. We can't crack that nut, we're in big doo-doo. And that's the first issue that we have to do. We also have to do it in a concentrated way. I spent 95% of my time on economic development when I was mayor. It wasn't enough. And unless we do it in a concentrated way, and we do it across the board and across jurisdictions, and we stop fighting with each other across jurisdictions, and we're able to weed out what is real versus what is make-believe, and we stop dealing with symbolism about are you pro-business or anti-business, and start talking about what's good for the community, there is no good future for us. Although I'm optimistic enough to believe that this is a very, very strong community. We have survived an enormous amount of bad government, bad circumstances, bad times, because we're very passionate about who we are. And that passion and the good sense translates to making some of this stuff possible. In the bad sense, it ends up us fighting over everything. And how we direct that passion, I think, determines the future of our community.
All right, for now, we're going to take a short break, but when we will return, we will continue this discussion, turning to the future of the city of Tucson.
Hi, I'm Lorraine Rivera. Tonight on Arizona Week, the I-11 corridor and its economic impact on Arizona.
Arizona needs to fight to keep its share of trade and to grow its percentage. And these are the types of initiatives that will help us compete.
Welcome back. Tucson voters will help decide the future of the city at the ballot box in November. This week, we're discussing the past and present of the city of Tucson as a framework for what's next and what's at stake in that vote. Once again, here in the studio with me are political science professor Tom Volgy, who's a former Tucson councilman and former mayor. Joe Burchell spent decades covering the city of Tucson as a reporter for the Arizona Daily Star before he became editor of the paper's government coverage. And Daisy Jenkins is a former executive at Raytheon and Carondelet Health Network. She is now the chairwoman of the United Way of Southern Arizona. Thanks again for being here to all of you. We focused first on where the city has been, what drove the present political and policy reality. Now let's look at what's to come. And I'll start with you, Joe. What do you think is the biggest issue the city needs to solve today?
It's easy for me, getting control of the budget. We're now enduring the longest bus strike in Tucson history, largely because the city doesn't have funds to pay for what it wants done. We almost had an impasse with the blue-collar workers, same reason. Decades ago, we had a city manager by the name of Joel Valdez. Joel once told me, everything that we're going to do is somewhere in the budget, you just have to find it. And it was true. This government currently has no control over its budget. The big bomb is going to explode when it comes to funding pensions a year or two from now. It could drive us to bankruptcy. I don't think it will. It could. They let it go 5 years ago. They have to do something about it now.
Ms. Jenkins, I wanted to ask you about pensions coming from the private sector. We constantly hear that the pension obligations that the city has are what drives the budget deficit that we are in. Mm-hmm. Now, we don't hear about that with the private sector. What's the difference?
Well, there are so many complexities associated with pension, with the pension process. And unfortunately, municipalities, government, they are behind private industry, the private sector, in addressing pension issues. The private sector went to defined contributions, and I know this gets very complex, went to defined contributions where really the risk is on the employee.
Something like a 401k.
Yes, exactly, 401k. And whereas the cities and the municipalities have defined benefits, which means that they will pay a lifetime annuity based on someone's ending salary. And with increased longevity, and if you have an early retirement age, my goodness, it compounds the issue because there's also problems with the worker to retiree ratio. It's not something that can be resolved in the short term because even if they make massive changes, the entering workforce can't make a big difference in the pension issue.
Could I compare the reality to the Social Security situation? You mentioned not enough people maybe paying, not enough present workers paying into these retirement systems. Is it like the federal Social Security
It's very
issue?
much like that. And it's underfunding because during the recession, of course, the revenue generation didn't occur that was anticipated. So it's a very complex issue. There's a lot of emotion in it. And unfortunately, and there are also multiple pensions within the city. So you get into the dynamics of that. It's difficult to solve, and it will be years before it's solved.
That's part of the issue. But the other piece of the issue, I think, is in the private sector, they have a greater ability to just do it to you. In the city, even when the city has tried to make changes in its pension funding plans, the various employee groups have gone to court, and the courts have overruled the governments, and so the city has less ability to change its pension funding.
Well, of course they have, and the reason why they have is because when you sign up to become a city employee, there is in effect a contract between you
Absolutely.
and the city, and it says that if you're going to work hard and you're going to put in the time and energy and effort, in return, this is what the result is going to be at the end. And if you change that in midstream, then the court's going to say you violated your contractual commitment. That's understandable. I agree, pension reform is going to be very, very important. Mm-hmm. The alternative, numerous different pension plans that the city has have to be integrated into one. At the same time, I want us to exercise just a little bit of caution here. One of the things I think all of us around this table take great pride in is that this is not a corrupt city. This is a clean city. In that sense, it's a well-run city with a couple of exceptions that have happened with our employees. It is, compared to what you witness in the Midwest or the East, with the exception possibly of California, this is a clean city. Part of the reason for that is because we say to our employees, we're going to treat you fairly, we're going to treat you well if you perform well. And part of that is about retirement when you are done serving 25, 30, 35 years in this community. We have to be careful. It works differently than the private sector. And given how low wages are in this community, given the enormous inequalities in this community, it has been the city and Raytheon and a couple of other actors that have played a leading important role in trying to raise wages in the community. If we backslide on that, the inequality issues in this community are going to get worse rather than better. And we have to think about that as well when we think about pension reform. We still need to do it, but we have to keep that in context.
I want to touch again on Suntran. You brought up the longest running strike the city's ever seen, and you're talking about wages, and those are the issues at the table right now. What is a possible solution to this?
About Suntran?
Yes.
Because
it is it's not just a present issue, it's a future issue as well.
Well, and I think we blew it in the very beginning. When we contracted out Suntran Services, we said something weird.
Were you in on that vote?
I believe I was in on that vote. I believe I was against that on the vote. We sort of said, people who work our public transit system are not our employees, but sort of. And they're sort of not. And we'll let these outsiders negotiate contractual relationships. And they went to the Teamsters, some of the toughest union people in the world, to negotiate for them. So they're caught in this weird kind of situation. I understand there are reasons why they are. But part of this issue is going to have to be the council, as Joe indicated earlier, deciding whether or not Suntran is a basic service that has to be available to everyone, or it's sort of a partial service that doesn't have to be available to everyone. It could get by with some differences in how it's being run. All these differences have got to be straightened out at the council table first.
And do we want to cut fares to get as many people as possible on the buses so they have a way to get to work and back, and so they're not driving the car and polluting my air? Do we want to jack up fares so that the bus service pays for itself? Do we want to go clear out to the Rincon Mountains, or do we want to stop at Wilmot? They have to make those decisions. They haven't, so they keep reversing themselves.
And none of these answers are obvious, you know?
Oh, and I don't have the solution. All I have is the criticism. I don't know how to fix it.
Yeah, well, I think Suntran is just symptomatic of many problems, you know, that the city's facing. And when your question about what are some of the biggest issues, we have to deal with the issue of poverty. And we also, the city has to be a contributor in creating a quality workforce that will attract as well as retain the businesses here. And I would suggest that the city is sometimes, well, I won't say out of touch, but to really understand the dynamics of what's going on in the broader community. The University of Arizona, the Southern Arizona Leadership Council, Sun Corda, former TRIO, created MAP Arizona, Making Action Possible. And it has 36 indicators from infrastructure, education, health and well-being, and tremendous data that would help the city be more proactive in understanding what are those indicators that are crucial to economic success, how do they interact with one another, and that could lead to more fact-based decision-making. I think that has to.
What kind of specific decisions should the council be making, future councils, for that poverty and economic development, those issues, improving those? What issues or votes would be at the city table?
Foundational education equates to qualified workforce. So it's employment, it's attracting businesses so that we have the employers to help move us above those very low wage jobs. We need higher wage jobs that are going to contribute to a higher quality of life.
But I think that the city, as an economic development driver, too often shuts people like Daisy out of the planning process. We are government, we can figure this out, and then we'll tell you what we want you to do. The city's notion, and Rio Nuevo isn't driving us to poverty, but how does the city manage economic development? Look at the ineptitude with Rio Nuevo. They chased every bright, shiny star they saw. They caught none of them. We got nothing for our money. We didn't bring private sector people in on a timely basis that let them help make decisions. We made them and said, you carry it out now. We need more involvement from outside of government.
I don't disagree with that, but there's a huge elephant in the room that we have not talked about.
We're down to our last minute, so you can introduce it.
I'll try to get to it really quickly. The number one issue CEOs raised for me when I recruited them was quality of the workforce. Number two issues of quality of life.
Yes.
Number three, that actually trumped the other two, was the education for my children.
Yeah.
And all those three are linked together. We don't have a system where we're able to, as a community, deal with the quality of our educational institutions in Tucson. We got to get to that really, really quickly before it's too late. Otherwise, all the other efforts are going to die, because that's a huge driver of everything that happens in Tucson.
Well, I really want to thank all of you for coming in. I feel like we could do this show every week and we could keep going, but we only have 30 minutes today. So That's what we're doing. Thank you so much for coming in. This discussion, we hope, will help give some perspective as voters head to the polls in November to choose 3 city council members. In the next few episodes of Metro Week, we'll talk to the candidates running for those seats. Our Journalist Roundtable will return next month, as usual. All the stories we produce at Arizona Public Media are available on our website. There you can listen to stories, play a live stream from NPR 89.1, and watch past episodes of this and other TV shows. Thanks for watching.